They say history turned on a single stone. A tomb sealed, then found open. A body missing. And with that absence, an empire of faith was born. The resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is not just a story. It is the cornerstone of Christianity, the foundation for 2,000 years of belief, worship, and power. The moment when death itself was said to be conquered, when the impossible became proof of the divine. Without the empty tomb there is no resurrection. And without the resurrection, the faith as we know it would collapse. But here lies the question no one dares to ask out loud. What if the tomb was never empty? What if the body was found, and then hidden? This is not the speculation of fringe thinkers alone. Buried in dusty archives and whispered through academic circles are traces of discoveries that paint a far more unsettling picture. Archaeologists stumbling upon burial chambers sealed for millennia. Stone boxes, ossuaries, marked with names that echo from the pages of Scripture. Bones that some claim belong not to an anonymous family, but to Jesus himself. And every time such evidence surfaces, the pattern repeats. A media storm flares up, scholars clash, and then suddenly, silence. Sites are closed. Artifacts disappear. Researchers retreat into obscurity. The trail goes cold. Why? Why would the possibility of Jesus's body being found spark such fear? Why would records vanish, testimonies shift, and institutions close ranks as though guarding not history, but a secret? We are told these findings are mistakes, fabrications, misunderstandings. Yet the shadows surrounding them suggest something else. Pressure applied from above, narratives carefully managed, stories of faith shielded by more than just belief. Because if the resurrection story crumbles, what else crumbles with it? The authority of the Church. The power of Scripture? The very idea that divinity walked among us. Consider this. What if truth itself has been entombed, sealed beneath centuries of denial? What if the most dangerous discovery in human history was quietly suppressed, not by enemies of faith, but by those who claim to protect it? We must ask ourselves, was the resurrection a miracle, or a story crafted to preserve hope? Were the whispers of hidden tombs the ramblings of skeptics, or fragments of a reality too dangerous to confront? And if bones once thought lost forever truly emerged from the earth, what lengths would the world's most powerful institutions go to ensure they were never seen again? Tonight, we will descend into this forbidden silence, into the forgotten excavations of Jerusalem, into the sealed vaults where ossuaries rest in shadow, and into the censored words of scholars who risked everything to tell us what they had seen. This is not a sermon. It is not a gospel. It is an autopsy of secrecy, a peeling back of the stone over truths that were meant to stay buried. Because if the tomb of Jesus was truly discovered, if his body was found and hidden away, then the story of history's greatest resurrection was never a story of light triumphing over death. It was the story of how death, inconvenient and undeniable, was buried twice. Once beneath the ground, and once beneath silence. So the question remains, suspended like a blade over centuries of faith. Was the tomb of Jesus lost to time, or deliberately suppressed to protect a truth too dangerous to reveal? The story begins at dawn in a garden just outside Jerusalem. A stone tomb, borrowed from a wealthy follower. A body hastily prepared before the Sabbath. A guard placed at the entrance to ensure no one could tamper with the resting place of a condemned man. 3 days later, the tomb is found open. The body is gone. Women who arrive with spices to anoint the corpse are instead greeted by emptiness, and according to the Gospels, by angels who declare the impossible. He is risen. From this moment history splits in two. To the faithful, the empty tomb is proof of the resurrection, the triumph of God over death itself. The cornerstone of Christianity. But to skeptics from the very beginning, the story raises questions. The Gospel of Matthew itself hints at this tension. It describes how, even in the earliest days, rumors spread that the body had been stolen, that disciples had taken it in the night. The text quickly dismisses this version, but the fact that it had to be mentioned at all shows something important. Doubt was woven into the story from the start. And those doubts never disappeared. Hidden among apocryphal writings, Gnostic Gospels, and later heretical texts are whispers of alternative endings, accounts in which Jesus was not resurrected in glory, but laid to rest like any other man. Stories where the body was moved, concealed, or buried in a secret place. Of course, the Church would come to label such writings as dangerous, false, and heretical. Entire councils were convened to decide which accounts would survive and which would be buried. But the very existence of these banned texts reveals something profound. Not everyone agreed on what happened in that tomb, and then there are the silences. The gaps. For centuries, pilgrims flocked to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, believing it to be the site of Jesus' burial and resurrection. But even among believers, the exact location of the tomb was disputed. Early Christians pointed to different sites, and in some cases, local traditions told of multiple burial chambers tied to the same story. If the resurrection was clear, why did the landscape of Jerusalem preserve so much confusion? Why did whispers of alternate tombs persist century after century? And why did the Church work so hard to silence every trace of those competing stories? The official account was clean, absolute, and miraculous. The underground accounts were messy, human, and frightening. They suggested a Jesus who died and remained dead, a teacher, perhaps even a prophet, but not a God. And here lies the danger. If the body of Jesus could be found, faith would collapse under the weight of the evidence. The resurrection would shift from a divine truth to a story constructed from absence. Christianity itself would transform from revelation into legend. So the doubts were contained. The texts outlawed. The whispers branded as heresy. For centuries, the official version stood unchallenged in public, yet always stalked by shadows in private. And then came the modern age, when archaeology entered the stage. Spades began to dig where Scripture had once stood unchallenged. Stone coffins were unearthed, inscriptions studied, bones catalogued. And suddenly the whispers of underground doubts were no longer confined to forbidden texts. They began to take physical shape. Because in the dust beneath Jerusalem, there were tombs that didn't fit the official story. Tombs that carried names too familiar, evidence too sharp, and possibilities too dangerous. Which brings us to the first sparks of controversy in the modern era. The alleged discoveries that some say were accidents, and others say were cover-ups. History is rarely erased in a single sweep. More often, it lingers in fragments, half-buried accounts, misfiled documents, whispers that refuse to die. And when it comes to the story of Jesus' burial, those whispers surface again and again, like a rumor the earth itself cannot contain. By the Middle Ages, the official resurrection story was firmly entrenched. The Church guarded it with fire and sword, branding anyone who questioned it a heretic. Yet beneath this wall of certainty, strange reports kept leaking through. Pilgrims who returned from Jerusalem spoke of multiple holy tombs. Competing shrines marked different burial chambers, some revered by local Christians, others quietly dismissed by the Church as impostors. One 12th century traveler described a chamber outside the city walls, a rock-cut tomb said to hold the bones of a great teacher. The account was written off as confused, even delusional. But buried in the margins of history, it reads less like a mistake and more like a clue. Fast forward to the 19th century. Archaeology was beginning to peel away the layers of the Holy Land with new precision. And with every excavation, the unease grew. Reports circulated of ossuaries, Stone boxes used for Jewish burials, marked with names familiar to any Sunday sermon. Joseph, Mary, Judah, James. Names common enough in Jerusalem, yes, but unsettling when found clustered together in a single tomb. Scholars argued. Believers protested. Each discovery was explained away, rationalized, or forgotten. But in letters, journals, and private correspondences, a different picture emerges. Archaeologists who stumbled upon tombs that felt too close to the biblical narrative, and who feared what the church or their patrons might say if their findings became public. One researcher wrote of a burial site that matches too well the story we are told. Another described bones reburied quietly under government orders, for fear of stirring unrest. These notes, scattered and fragmented, suggest a pattern. Whenever a find seemed to brush against the sacred narrative, silence followed. Why were these records hidden in private journals instead of published papers? Why did bones vanish into reburial while pottery and coins from the same site were proudly displayed in museums? Why did whispers of a lost tomb hover over Jerusalem long before the 20th century? Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was reverence. Or perhaps it was something more calculated, the quiet recognition that some discoveries are simply too dangerous to make public. And the questions did not stop there. In the early 20th century, a few bold voices hinted at suppressed knowledge. A French scholar suggested in 1926 that the true tomb of Jesus may have been located and concealed. His words were met with ridicule. His funding was cut. His work never advanced. But the rumor lived on, finding its way into underground discussions among theologians, archaeologists, and skeptics alike. It is easy now to dismiss these whispers as coincidence, paranoia, or the overactive imagination of researchers working in the Holy Land. And yet, when the same story appears across centuries, tombs that match too well, relics that vanish, names that cut too close to Scripture, we are left with a troubling possibility. Could it be that hints of the lost tomb have surfaced not once, but many times? And if so, why were they ignored, silenced, or erased? By the time the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948, archaeology in Jerusalem had become a battlefield, not just of history but of identity, politics, and faith. Every stone unearthed carried weight. Every inscription could challenge centuries of belief. And it is here, in this volatile landscape, that the whispers would finally erupt into something undeniable. Because in 1980, a construction crew digging in the East Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem would stumble upon a tomb unlike any other. A tomb whose inscriptions would ignite a storm of controversy. A tomb that some would call the family tomb of Jesus. But before we enter that chamber, we must ask, were the whispers leading us here all along? Were the lost journals, reburied bones, and silenced scholars fragments of a story that had been suppressed for centuries? A story that could no longer be hidden once the earth itself gave up the tomb? It began with construction, not scripture, not prophecy, not even archaeology. In March of 1980, a crew was carving foundations for a new apartment complex in the East Talpiot neighborhood of Jerusalem when their drills broke into something unexpected. Beneath the modern city lay a chamber sealed for nearly 2 millennia. A rock-cut tomb, undisturbed, waiting. Inside were 10 ossuaries, limestone boxes used in first-century Jewish burials to hold the bones of the dead after the flesh had decayed. Their surfaces were covered in dust, their inscriptions faint but visible. For most, it would have been just another find, one tomb among the thousands scattered around Jerusalem. But these boxes carried names. And not just any names. On one ossuary, Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. On another, Maria, Mary. On another, Yos, a shortened form of Joseph, the very nickname used for one of Jesus's brothers in the Gospels. Another carried the name Mattia, Matthew. Another, Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus. And perhaps most haunting of all, one inscribed with Miriam. Some later argued this could be Mary Magdalene, though the debate still burns. Names that appear countless times in Jerusalem's records of the era, yes. But together, gathered in one family tomb, the clustering raised more than eyebrows. Could this tomb, unearthed by accident, be the resting place of Jesus of Nazareth and his family? The implications were volcanic. If these bones belonged to Jesus, then the resurrection story collapses. If Jesus was buried here, he was never raised. If Jesus had a son, Judah, son of Jesus, then the entire framework of Christian teaching is called into question. The archaeologists who documented the find noted the inscriptions, catalogued the ossuaries, and then, curiously, allowed them to be placed into storage out of sight. The bones inside? Removed and reburied in a Jewish cemetery, as was common practice. The details of the inscriptions barely made headlines at the time, and that silence is perhaps the most disturbing part of the story. Here was a tomb carrying the most explosive names in human history. Yet it was treated like just another excavation. The world barely noticed. The church said nothing. And the discovery was quietly forgotten for nearly 2 decades. Why? Why did this tomb not ignite global debate in 1980? Why were the bones reburied so quickly before DNA analysis could be conducted? Why were the inscriptions photographed, catalogued, and then buried in archives? It was not until the 1990s that whispers began to resurface. A BBC documentary in 1996 revisited the find, suggesting its significance had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. A decade later, in 2007, filmmakers Simcha Jakubowski and James Cameron would unleash The Lost Tomb of Jesus, a documentary that reignited the firestorm, claiming the Talpiot tomb was indeed the family resting place of Jesus. Scholars clashed. Some called the statistical clustering of the names too powerful to dismiss. Others argued the names were common and meaningless. Faith leaders rejected the claim outright, dismissing it as sensationalism. And yet, the questions remained. Why did the bones vanish into reburial before modern testing? Why were the ossuaries tucked into storage, hidden from public display? Why did the discovery linger in silence for so long, only to explode decades later when cameras finally turned toward it? Perhaps the Talpiot tomb was simply one of many family burials, its name's a coincidence. Or perhaps it was something more, a secret too dangerous to handle, buried not only in stone, but in silence. As one archaeologist later admitted off record, if this tomb is what some say it is, then Christianity itself must be rewritten. And no one is ready for that. The chamber in East Talpiot was quiet when it was first opened, a hollow carved into limestone nearly 2,000 years earlier. 10 boxes sat inside, plain to the untrained eye, dust-coated, stacked like forgotten relics. At first glance, they could have belonged to anyone, a middle-class family lost to history, one tomb among the many that honeycombed Jerusalem's underworld. But then the inscriptions were read, and the silence of the tomb broke into questions no one wanted to answer. On one ossuary, the inscription was simple. Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. 3 words, etched by a grieving hand nearly 2 millennia ago, carrying the potential to shake the foundations of faith itself. Nearby, another box bore the name Maria, a name sacred in Christian memory, a name tied to the mother of Jesus. Again, common in Jerusalem at the time, but when paired with Yeshua bar Yosef, the coincidence began to feel uncanny. Another bore the name Yos, a nickname used in the Gospels for one of Jesus' brothers. Another still, Mattia, Matthew, another name echoed in the Christian tradition. And then came the box inscribed Yehuda bar Yeshua. Judah, son of Jesus. For believers, this was more than troubling. If authentic, it suggested that Jesus had fathered a child, a possibility the Church has rejected for 2 millennia. And then came perhaps the most debated ossuary of all, Miriam. Some scholars argued this referred to Mary Magdalene, portrayed in apocryphal texts as closer to Jesus than the canonical Gospels admit. If so, the implication is staggering. Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and their child interred together in one tomb. The cluster of names reads like a roll call from Scripture, gathered in one chamber. A statistical impossibility, some argued. A coincidence, others insisted. But statistics are not what made the ossuaries dangerous. It was the questions they forced that if Yeshua bar Yosef lay here, bones packed into stone, then the resurrection story falters. The miracle dissolves. The faith collapses into history. If Yehuda bar Yeshua truly translates to Judah, son of Jesus, then the celibate Savior becomes a man with bloodlines, a father whose descendants could, in theory, still walk among us. If Miriam was indeed Mary Magdalene, then the hidden threads of suppressed Gospels that spoke of her importance, even her leadership, begin to resurface. And if all these names were gathered together by chance, why then did the tomb vanish from memory so quickly? After its discovery? Why did these inscriptions, so meticulously documented, remain buried in archives for decades? Scholars fought bitterly over the details. Some said the inscriptions were too worn to be read with certainty. Others claimed the translations were slanted. Still others pointed out that names like Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were common in first-century Jerusalem, appearing on countless ossuaries. But even in their commonness, these names carried uncommon weight. For it was not just that the names existed, it was that they existed together in one chamber on 10 ossuaries, unearthed in the heart of Jerusalem, and beneath the academic sparring lay a deeper, darker tension. The realization that perhaps it wasn't about coincidence at all. Perhaps it was about containment. Because whether authentic or not, these names, these ossuaries, posed a threat. A threat not just to faith, but to authority, to the institutions built upon the resurrection story. And so the questions linger. Why were the bones inside reburied so quickly? Why did no one preserve them for testing when DNA and carbon analysis could have provided answers? Why did the ossuaries themselves vanish into storage, hidden from the public eye? Was it negligence? Bureaucracy? Or was it something more deliberate? In the end, the ossuaries remain. Silent stone boxes, carrying words etched in grief, words the world was not ready to hear. Words that some argue point to the most dangerous possibility of all, that the tomb was never empty, that the bones of Jesus were gathered, sealed in limestone, and then buried again, not beneath earth but beneath silence. Every discovery leaves a trail, not just of stone and bone but of people. The men and women who enter tombs, lift relics from the earth, and dare to publish what they find. Yet when it comes to the Talpiot tomb, that trail is littered not with fame and acclaim, but with silence, ridicule, and careers cut short. The excavation of 1980 was led by Amos Kloner, a respected Israeli archaeologist. His team cataloged the ossuaries, photographed the inscriptions, and filed the official reports. To Kloner, it was one tomb among many, though even he admitted years later that the names were remarkable. And yet, he dismissed the possibility that it could have been the family of Jesus. In interviews, he insisted the clustering of names was a coincidence. But his quick dismissal left lingering doubts. Did he truly believe it? Or did he know the danger of saying otherwise? Because others who looked closer paid a price. When filmmakers and independent researchers revisited the tomb in the 1990s and 2000s, they leaned on Kloner's notes. But those who dared to suggest publicly that this tomb might belong to Jesus were ridiculed by both academia and religious authorities. Careers were threatened, funding pulled, reputations shredded. Take the case of scholars who studied the ossuary inscriptions. Some argued that Miriam was a specific name linked to Mary Magdalene in apocryphal texts. When they published, they were accused of sensationalism, their credibility attacked. Some left academia altogether. Others faced quieter forms of silencing. Conference papers rejected. Invitations rescinded. Research grants that mysteriously evaporated. Whispers in university halls that their names were now toxic. And always behind the criticism, the same unspoken fear. What if they were right? What if the tomb truly belonged to Jesus and his family? Because if it were true, the implications would be catastrophic. The resurrection collapses. The divinity of Jesus crumbles. Christianity itself would be forced to confront a reality it was never built to survive. And so, a pattern emerged. Those who kept their interpretations tame, who said the names were coincidence, the bones anonymous, found their careers untouched. But those who dared to speak louder, who pushed the possibility of Jesus' lost tomb, found themselves silenced. That it is easy to explain this as the natural clash of scholarship. Bold claims shot down by rigorous critique. But when critique turns into destruction, when professional lives are buried as swiftly as the bones themselves, one must ask, is this science or suppression? Consider this. Why were the bones reburied so quickly after the tomb was opened, making DNA testing impossible for decades? Why were the ossuaries placed in storage, their inscriptions collecting dust? Why did the most provocative questions, could this be Jesus? Could he have had a family? Never make it into the official reports? It is almost as if the tomb itself was not the only thing sealed. The conversation was too. And the finders? They became ghosts in their own field. Scholars who touched the tomb were remembered not for their work, but for the controversy that followed them. Researchers who speculated too far became cautionary tales. The message was clear: dig too deep into this story and it will bury you instead. Some even whisper that pressure was applied not just by academic peers, but by more powerful institutions, governments, religious authorities, organizations with every reason to ensure the resurrection story remained untouchable. Whether by ridicule, by career strangulation, or by quiet orders from above, the effect was the same. The tomb stayed hidden, not beneath stone this time, but beneath silence. And so the question lingers: were the scholars wrong, silenced because their theories were flawed? Or were they silenced because their words cut too close to a truth the world was not prepared to face? The strangest thing about the Talpiot tomb isn't just what was found inside. It's what happened after. In archaeology, important discoveries usually mean years of study. Bones are analyzed, inscriptions debated, artifacts carefully preserved and tested. But in the case of this tomb, the process ended almost as soon as it began. After the ossuaries were removed and catalogued in 1980, the bones were quietly reburied in a cemetery of unknown location. The tomb was resealed. And the site itself, one of the most extraordinary clusterings of biblical names ever discovered, was closed. No follow-up digs. No extended forensic analysis. No carbon dating of the bones. No DNA testing until decades later, and even then, under heavily restricted conditions. Instead, the tomb sat in silence, covered by an apartment complex, as if it had never been opened at all. For archaeologists, this was deeply unusual. Most tombs in Jerusalem remain accessible for decades, sometimes indefinitely, with scholars returning again and again to study them. But not this one. The Talpiot site was treated as if it were too dangerous to touch. Why? One explanation is bureaucratic. The Israel Antiquities Authority is protective of ancient remains, and reburying bones is standard practice out of respect for Jewish law. That's true. But many scholars have noted that the speed of the reburial was suspicious. It left no time for wider academic review, no chance for independent labs to weigh in. It was as if the evidence was buried before the questions could even be asked. And then came the denials. Official reports described the tomb in neutral, unremarkable terms. The inscriptions, they said, were common names. The cluster was coincidence. Nothing to see here. But behind the official calm, something more unsettling seemed to unfold. Filmmakers and researchers who later requested access to the tomb reported unusual resistance. Doors closed. Permits delayed. Requests denied. When the site was eventually reopened for limited study in the early 2000s, cameras were tightly controlled, time inside rationed, access restricted to only a handful of approved participants. It gave the impression not of open science, but of a controlled narrative. And then there is the tomb's location itself. The Talpiot site sits beneath an ordinary housing development. Residents live their daily lives above what some call the Jesus family tomb, yet most of them have never seen it, never been allowed inside. The fact that it was sealed beneath concrete, an apartment block of all things, only adds to the suspicion. Was it an accident of urban development? Or a deliberate way of keeping the tomb out of reach, hidden in plain sight? The parallels are chilling. For centuries, inconvenient truths have been buried not only beneath soil but beneath silence. In colonial America, bones of enslaved people were removed from churchyards, their existence erased from records. In Europe, heretical texts were burned, their words lost except in whispers. The tactic is always the same. When something threatens the story that society is built upon, it is not debated. It is buried, and so it was here. The Talpiot tomb became a ghost site. On maps it was marked and filed away. In official reports it was reduced to data points. In memory, it became just another ossuary cluster among hundreds. But beneath the bureaucratic layers, its true weight lingered. Because if the inscriptions were right, if the bones really did belong to the family of Jesus, then the foundations of Christian theology could crack. The resurrection would be reinterpreted, not as bodily ascension, but as something else entirely. Is it any wonder the excavation was closed? What better way to ensure the debate never gained traction than to simply seal the tomb, rebury the bones, and declare the case closed? It is one thing to silence scholars. But silencing stone, that requires a different kind of power. A power that can lock away history itself. And so, the site waits. Beneath an apartment building, beneath layers of soil and silence, a tomb holds its secrets. Perhaps forever. Perhaps until someone forces the locks open again. The question is not whether the evidence is there. The question is, who has the power to keep it buried? Once the tomb was sealed, the battle did not end. It simply moved to another battlefield, not in stone but in numbers. Because if the bones and ossuaries could no longer be freely examined, the names carved into them could still be debated. And that debate became a war of probability. Here is the heart of it. Inside one family tomb, archaeologists documented multiple inscriptions. Yeshua, son of Joseph. Maria. Yos. Miriam. Even a version of Judah, son of Jesus. On their own, each name might be dismissed. Together, however, they form a cluster so strange it demands explanation. How likely is it that this exact set of names, names central to the New Testament, would appear in one tomb in Jerusalem from the right century in the right neighborhood? That is where the numbers began to twist like a serpent. Supporters of the Talpiot theory, most famously statistician Andre Feuerwerger, calculated staggering odds. He argued that the probability of this name cluster appearing randomly was as low as 1 in 600, or even 1 in 2 million depending on which assumptions you used. To him, the math was overwhelming. This wasn't coincidence. It was evidence. But almost immediately, critics attacked the calculations. They argued the names were common. That Yeshua, Joseph, and Mary were as frequent then as John or James today. That the odds collapsed once you admitted how many tombs existed in Jerusalem and how many names repeated within them. That it became a war of assumptions. Which names counted as part of the Jesus family? Was Miriam really Mary Magdalene, or just another woman? Should Judah, son of Jesus, even be included, since theology denies Jesus had a son? And what about tombs that were never discovered, lost to time, that could have contained similar clusters? Each side massaged the numbers until they bent toward their conclusion. And yet the fact remained, the Talpiot tomb did contain the names. The math wasn't theoretical. The stones were real. What emerged was less a scholarly debate and more a proxy war. Supporters accused the establishment of statistical gymnastics designed to protect doctrine. Critics accused filmmakers and researchers of sensationalism, of cherry-picking the math to inflate mystery where none existed. But in the middle of the fight, one truth went unnoticed. Statistics were being used not to find answers, but to bury them. Because numbers can silence as effectively as censorship. Numbers can be weaponized. Numbers can be made to say anything provided you choose the right denominators, the right assumptions, the right framing. That it was no longer about what was in the tomb. It was about who controlled the narrative of probability. The chilling part is how familiar this tactic feels. Throughout history, statistics have been used to erase as much as reveal. Colonial censuses that erased indigenous identities. Crime reports that distorted entire communities. Health records that minimized plagues until the bodies piled too high to ignore. The math is never neutral. It always serves someone. And in the case of Talpiot, it seemed to serve the idea that nothing extraordinary had been found. That the tomb was ordinary, unremarkable, a footnote rather than a rupture. But the public sensed otherwise. Documentaries sparked outrage. Scholars who argued against coincidence were mocked as sensationalists, yet they kept asking the question. Why, if the odds were so low, did the establishment rush to bury the evidence rather than investigate further? What emerges from this numbers war is not clarity, but fog. A fog thick enough to obscure the stones themselves, until the tomb becomes less an archaeological site than a battlefield of probabilities. And in that fog, one fact lingers like a shadow. Statistics are not truth. They are stories told with numbers. And stories can be manipulated. Which raises the darker possibility, was the statistics war merely an accident of scholarly disagreement? Or was it another suppression tactic designed to drown the tomb in a sea of math, where no one could ever grasp its true weight? What happens when history is rewritten not with fire or silence, but with fractions? That is the weapon most people never see until it's too late. If statistics blurred the story, then science was supposed to sharpen it. DNA, after all, cannot be bribed, cannot be silenced, cannot be bought. Or so the public was told. When filmmakers and researchers turned back to the Talpiot tomb in the mid-2000s, they reached for the weapon of modern science, genetic testing. Inside the limestone ossuaries lay traces of bone dust, fragments of life reduced to powder. From these relics, DNA could be drawn, the closest thing to a voice the dead can still give. The testing was done quietly. Few were told, fewer still invited. And then, with great theatricality, the results were announced. According to the team, DNA extracted from the ossuary labeled, Yeshua son of Joseph, did not match the DNA from Miriam. This, they argued, proved that Miriam was not his blood relative. Therefore they claimed she must have been his wife. And if the ossuary of Judah son of Jesus belonged to their child, then the Talpiot tomb was not just a family crypt. It was the family crypt of Jesus of Nazareth. The claim landed like an earthquake. It was bold. It was cinematic. It was, to many, irresistible. But almost immediately the cracks began to show. For one thing, the DNA tests were limited, far too limited. Only 2 ossuaries were sampled. No attempt was made to cross-test all the names, to build a genetic web that could confirm or deny family ties. And perhaps most suspiciously of all, the original bone samples were quickly destroyed in the process, leaving nothing for independent scientists to examine. Critics pounced. They argued the methodology was incomplete, the conclusions irresponsible. After all, a DNA mismatch between 2 individuals doesn't prove marriage. It proves only that they aren't related. The leap from not siblings to husband and wife was, as one geneticist put it, a chasm filled more with theology than biology. Others raised darker suspicions. Why were the tests kept so narrow? Why were only certain ossuaries sampled? Why was there no comprehensive report released for peer review? And why, after so much controversy, did the samples vanish into dust, as if the evidence itself had been designed to evaporate? What could have been the most definitive moment in the Talpiot investigation became instead another battlefield of ambiguity? And perhaps that was the point. Because DNA has a strange power in the modern imagination. It feels absolute, unquestionable, a language of truth written into our cells. But here it was used like a magician's flourish, a flash of science that dazzled the audience, while ensuring that no one could look too closely at the trick itself. To believers, the DNA tests whispered of revelation. To skeptics, they reeked of manipulation. And in the end, the results accomplished something more subtle than proof or disproof. They bought time. They deepened the fog. They ensured that the Talpiot tomb would remain entangled in controversy rather than clarity. It is a tactic we've seen before. Evidence is not erased, but half revealed. Enough to ignite debate, never enough to settle it. Enough to inspire documentaries and headlines, never enough to survive peer review. The DNA that could have confirmed history instead became part of the machinery that buries it. Think about that. The very tool invented to uncover truth was turned into a shield against it. Not by accident, but through selective sampling, selective interpretation, selective release. Science was weaponized, not to answer the question of Talpiot, but to keep it forever unanswered. And so the tomb remained in limbo, caught between mathematics that couldn't be trusted, and genetics that wouldn't be repeated. Yet within that limbo lies a chilling possibility. If the tests had been expanded, if all the ossuaries had been mapped, compared, cross-checked, perhaps we would now hold in our hands the most explosive family tree in human history. Perhaps the DNA would have forced the world to confront a Jesus who lived not as an isolated figure of doctrine, but as a man with bloodlines and descendants that shattered the neat story of resurrection. But we will never know. The samples are gone. The chance has been buried. Which leaves us with the most dangerous truth of all. Sometimes science doesn't erase mystery. It manufactures it, and the Talpiot tomb is its most haunting example. Every controversy has its tipping point. With Talpiot, the spark of DNA, the heat of mathematics, the whispers of inscriptions. All of it should have ignited a firestorm. But instead, the noise was smothered, the embers stamped out. This wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of design. From the moment the Talpiot tomb entered the public conversation, powerful hands began to steady the narrative. Archaeological authorities in Israel downplayed the find, dismissing it as coincidence. Religious leaders branded it blasphemy, a distraction designed to erode faith. Even within academia, voices that tried to defend deeper investigation found themselves drowned out by a chorus of ridicule. It was a full-spectrum pushback. Not chaotic, but coordinated. Consider the timing. Excavations were halted almost as soon as they began, with permits revoked and access denied. The tomb, which could have been one of the most significant archaeological sites in human history, was sealed and left to the weeds. Officials cited safety and regulation, but locals reported that soldiers stood guard, and researchers who asked for further entry found doors firmly closed. Meanwhile, media coverage took a strange turn. Documentaries aired with bold claims, then disappeared from circulation, their rights tangled in legal disputes. Articles appeared in major newspapers only to be followed by swift rebuttals, often penned by experts who had not personally examined the tomb. A pattern emerged. Every time the story rose into the light, it was quickly dragged back into shadow. And the public, already primed by decades of skepticism about sensational discoveries, absorbed the signal. This was fringe. This was foolish. This was a story unworthy of belief. It is a tactic older than censorship. Don't silence a voice, drown it in noise. Don't burn the evidence, bury it under layers of ridicule and bureaucracy until no one dares to dig again. For those who pushed back hardest, the stakes were obvious. If the Talpiot tomb truly housed Jesus of Nazareth and his family, then the cornerstone of Christianity, the resurrection, becomes not a spiritual truth, but a narrative invention. Entire theological empires would shake. Pilgrimage sites would lose their power. And the idea of Jesus as both divine and untouchable would collapse into the image of a man, subject to love, family, and death like all the rest of us. But it wasn't just the church. Governments too had reasons to bury Talpiot. A discovery of this magnitude would redraw fault lines in a region already bleeding from ancient wounds. The idea of a physical Jesus, bound by history and land, would inflame the political fires of Jerusalem in ways almost too dangerous to imagine. And so, instead of excavation, there was delay. Instead of dialogue, dismissal. Instead of openness, obfuscation. Researchers who questioned the silence soon faced consequences. Some found funding mysteriously withdrawn. Others were branded as conspiracy theorists in their fields. Careers that had taken decades to build were tarnished in months. The message was clear. Touch the tomb and it will bury you instead. The machinery of silence is rarely built from one piece. It is gears and levers all turning together. Archaeological authority, religious outrage, academic ridicule, media manipulation, political caution. Each mechanism reinforced the others until Talpiot became something worse than a scandal. It became a non-story, and yet the silence does not erase the unease, because if the tomb were truly meaningless, if it were just another burial site among thousands, why bother silencing it at all? Why guard the ground? Why kill the debate? Why let samples vanish into irretrievable dust? The answer is almost too chilling to speak aloud. Sometimes the easiest way to hide the truth is not to destroy it, but to let it rot in plain sight. And that is where Talpiot still lies. A sealed chamber, half known, half buried, existing like a wound under the skin of history. It is not that no one knows what it contains. It is that too many do, and that knowledge is precisely what demands its burial. History has a way of surfacing, even when every effort is made to drown it. The Talpiot tomb was supposed to fade, sealed behind stone and silence. Yet decades later, it continues to haunt. Not because the case was ever solved, but because it never was. In hushed corners of archaeology conferences, scholars still whisper about the inscriptions, the names, the odds, the DNA. Some dismiss it as coincidence, others call it a statistical miracle. But the conversation never dies. It lingers like a shadow that refuses to leave the room. Even the public, half exposed to the story through scattered documentaries and forgotten headlines, can't quite let go. Online forums dissect grainy photographs of ossuaries. Independent researchers chase down missing bone samples. Artists, filmmakers, and novelists return again and again to the question, what if it's real? It is as though the Talpiot tomb itself resists erasure. The silence, instead of smothering, has deepened the mystery. Because every locked door becomes a dare. Every unanswered question becomes an obsession. And every cover-up, whether real or imagined, feeds the hunger to look closer. But here is the most unsettling truth. The tomb may not need to be solved to change history. It already has. For centuries, faith was built on the certainty that no grave for Jesus exists. That his body rose, vanished, ascended. To even whisper the possibility of a tomb is to crack the foundation. To seal that tomb and forbid entry is to widen the fracture further, because secrecy always suggests there is something worth hiding. And so the Talpiot tomb endures as a paradox. Too dangerous to study, too powerful to forget. Its power lies not in proof, but in possibility. The possibility that Jesus was more human than divine. That his story was shaped not only by faith, but by family, blood, and mortality. That beneath modern Jerusalem lies not just stone and dust, but the bones of a man the world turned into a god. The silence itself has become part of the evidence. Why were samples lost? Why was excavation stopped? Why, in a world where we exhume pharaohs, saints, and kings, is this single tomb left untouched? The longer the questions echo, the louder they become. And perhaps this is why the Talpiot tomb feels alive, like something buried but restless. A sight less like a grave and more like a locked door in a haunted house. Every generation walks past it, feels the chill, and wonders what waits on the other side. The danger isn't only historical. If tomorrow the tomb were opened, examined with modern technology, and authenticated, the impact would be seismic. Entire religious structures could collapse overnight. Political powers would scramble to control the narrative. The world's most contested city would ignite anew. Perhaps that is the true reason for the silence. Not fear of the past, but fear of the future. And so the Talpiot tomb remains where it began. A chamber of stone beneath the living city, holding secrets it will not release. A place where faith, archaeology, politics, and silence collide. It is not just a tomb. It is a mirror point, one that forces us to confront a question humanity has never been ready to answer. What happens when the divine is revealed to be mortal? The story of the Talpiot tomb does not end with answers. It ends with silence. And maybe that silence is the loudest sound of all. Because every grave, every inscription, every fragment of bone ever unearthed has spoken, except this one. This tomb has been buried twice, once by time and soil, and again by human hands determined to seal it forever. But silence cannot erase doubt. It only feeds it. What makes the Talpiot discovery so haunting is not the stone boxes themselves, but the questions they drag behind them like chains. If this is the family tomb of Jesus, why has it been left untouched? If it is not, why do those in power move so quickly to smother its memory? And what are we to make of the missing pieces, the lost DNA? Samples, the forgotten inscriptions, the files that vanish from archives as if they were never written. These questions do not fade. They multiply. They circle back. They haunt. And here is the truth. Perhaps the greatest danger is not that the tomb exists, but that people believe it does. Because faith is not built on artifacts. Faith is built on stories, and once a different story begins to spread, it cannot be contained. In the end, the Talpiot tomb is more than stone and dust. It has become a ghost. A presence that lingers at the edges of history, whispering just enough to unsettle, but never enough to confirm. Some say the tomb is nothing. An ordinary grave inflated by coincidence. Others say it is everything, the final resting place of the man whose absence was supposed to prove his divinity? But both sides miss the truth. The tomb's power lies not in what it is, but in what it suggests. That the past is never fully buried. That history has cracks. And through those cracks, light, or shadows, always slip in. So tonight, as you turn away from this story, remember this. The silence after the stone is not an ending. It is an invitation. An invitation to question the stories we inherit. An invitation to wonder what else lies beneath the ground we walk. An invitation to ask, what if? Because once that question is spoken, it can never be unspoken. And perhaps that is the tomb's final miracle. Not that it holds answers, but that it refuses to let us stop asking.